no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. It's good to have you back, Sadie. I know last week didn't have Sadie on, had Chad Harris on instead, and that was a fun episode, but I'm good to be back with you, my BFF, talking about Revelation. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for hanging in there while I was out for a couple episodes. There was a family emergency in my family, and I was just the best equipped person to jump in and crisis manage, if that makes sense. I'm really, really thankful that I had the time to do that and take care of what needed to be taken care of, and I'm glad to be back now.
I'm glad to have you back. I'm glad to be making this show with you because...
Well, now we get to talk about more trauma.
More trauma. If you have Revelation trauma and you want to deconstruct it, then this is the episode for you, because we are going into... Well, why don't you talk about it? Why don't you give the...
Yeah. So let's see. The last episode we talked about in the series, the Revelation series, we talked about different literal and non-literal approaches to interpreting the book of Revelation. We started to get into some of the symbolism in the book of Revelation, which led to some odd rabbit trails. We talked about dispensationalism. We talked about the Olivet discourse and how that maybe fits into the Revelation narrative. And then we also talked about how the rapture is really tough to fit into the Revelation narrative. And so now we can finally get into what the IFB believe about the events of the tribulation and what sort of thing IFB teachers tend to focus on when they are trying to interpret Revelation.
So the tack that I think we're taking for this one, and I guess that we're taking for the other ones, we tried to kind of be like, okay, we're going to plan out on this day, we're going to talk about this subject, on this day, and then it ends up just being like, okay, we have a list of things that we want to, and we'll start at the top and then go through, do deconstruction on the side, then and it eventually gets us to where we want to go. So we don't know how many episodes are going to be in this Revelation series, but it's going to be
really hard to plan it out, y'all. I really did.
Life gets in the way.
I failed. That's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. God will forgive you.
I hope so. I hope I didn't take anything out of Revelation or add anything to Revelation. I don't want to be cursed.
Shoehorn something in Revelation that isn't there that you really need to fit into the narrative. Who would do such a thing?
Not me.
Anyway, before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast about my BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor, Sadie Carpenter, her life in and escape from the Independent Fundamental Baptist cult, the cult in which she was raised. We talk about this cult. We talk about other cults. We talk about religion. We talk about fundamentalism. We talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole. And it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you are a fan of our show, then there's a number of things that you can do to support us. You can join our Patreon. Patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast, where you can go and find extended, uncensored, ad-free versions of our episodes. They also come out a couple of days early, so if you just can't wait until Monday morning to get that new episode fresh to your ears, then you can go to our Patreon and get it, and you can listen to it over the weekend. You just got to have it right now. You can also go check out our Threadless shop. I hope by the time this episode comes out, I will have a new t-shirt design in, and I think we're going to try to do new Pride t-shirts this year, but we don't know exactly what those are going to be.
We never do, Gabi. This is the conversation that we have towards the end of April, beginning of May, every single year that we have had a podcast is, we should do Pride merch. Yeah, we should do Pride merch. What do you want to do? I don't know. And then we come up with fantastic ideas like on May 25th and get them out in time for Pride Month. That is every single year.
I want to try to get them out to people earlier this year, because if you can buy a Pride t-shirt, like if you order it during May, then it'll arrive before June, and then you can wear it because I don't know if if your city's going to have Pride on like June 5th, or if they're going to have it on like June 17th, or whatever day of June they're going to have it. You might want to wear the shirt to your Pride festival, and you might not get a chance to do that if we come out with the shirts too late.
Which has been a thing, yes.
Yeah, that has been a thing, and it's always just been, it's not because we're bad at it, it's because we're disorganized.
It's because this is a 100% neurodivergent run podcast.
This is a 100% also like we run this out of our seat of our pants and out of our like bedrooms / office rooms in our houses.
I have an office now. It used to be a closet, but now I have an office. Yeah, it's just the two of us doing our best. It is me continually trying to plan way out and failing, and Gavi also trying to plan way out and failing.
The other things that you can do to get more out of your Leaving Eden podcast experience is to join our Facebook group, join our subreddit. Both of those are called Eden Exodus. Great place to have a discussion, share memes, share conversation about religion. If you want to have a place where people are usually pretty respectful. Almost always people are very respectful in the Facebook group. And it is unique in that fact because there's very few places on the internet where people actually treat each other with respect. But I think there's like kind of a sense of shared community, shared like, oh, you've been through the same thing that I have, which is nice. And I guess now I just got to thank the patrons. Do you want me to thank them? I guess I'll thank the patrons
go ahead.
Today. So I gave it all to your patrons. Your names are I'm Not 1010, Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Manown, Melora King, and Todd Dale on the behalf of his lovely deconstructor Renex of a partner of a spouse, Madeline Antrim. Thank you guys so much for subscribing at the I Gave It All tier of our Patreon.
Yes, huge thank you to the I Gave It All tier patrons.
Yes, and our Faith Promise Missions tier patrons, your names are Alex P., Allie Allen, Autumn of Our Discontent, Brittany, Chrissa, Dora J., Eleanor Donahue, Hannah Ross, Hannah Montana, Hope Norum, Horton Here's a Shane, Janine Collin, Jana Connor, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Junie B. Jones. I guess the B doesn't stand for anything anymore, sadly. But Junie B. Jones.
The B stands for being left behind.
Oh no.
Junie B, if you do not update what the B stands for, I'm going to make something up every week.
Kat Henwood, Kay Turwee, Kristen Marie, Learned Vixen, Linda Morgan, Madeline Antrim, Madeline Cusick, Maddie the Seventh Day Badventist. Maybe the B in Junie B. Jones stands for Badventist.
Badventist, that must be it.
Badventist. Marlena Stuve, Mary Martin, Megan Arendt, Morgan, Rob the Methodist, Stephanie Johnson, Steve and Amy, Susie, Tara McNamara, and Wes the Cowboy. Thank you guys so much for subscribing to the Faith Promise Missions tier of our Patreon.
Yep. Big thank you to all, of course, the I Gave It All tier and Faith Promise Missions tier patrons, but to everybody who subscribes and supports us financially on Patreon. That is such a big help. And so are the non-financial ways that people support us, like following us on social media, recommending us to friends and family, subscribing on whatever podcast app you use, leaving us a good review. All of those things are huge benefits to us, and we appreciate all of them very much. Thank you.
If you want to hit the TW, and then we'll get into our episode.
Sure thing. In general, we talk about a lot of potentially triggering topics on this show, including but not limited to suicide and mental health, racism, misogyny, PTSD and PTSD symptoms, child abuse, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we'll mention at least a few of these topics. We try to avoid graphic detail unless it's relevant to the story that we're telling. And we do our best to give the audience a heads up if we do feel like we need to go into detail on any of these topics or anything else that we know can be triggering to listeners. This episode and the further episodes in this series are about the Book of Revelation, end times prophecies, the rapture, all of that sort of thing.
So when we left off, we had pretty much gotten to the point in Revelation where the rapture is happening. And everybody who has been saved in the correct way and who has done the 1, 2, 3 repeat after me and said the magic words is zoomed up to heaven, and everybody else is left behind.
Right. And some unfortunate people were pooping unless, as we discussed, God chose to wait until a time when no one was pooping.
So, serious question. Do children who are not baptized and not old enough to comprehend Jesus and sin and salvation, do they go up to heaven or do they stay below? Or can God tell whether or not you would have gotten saved if he had not done the rapture?
No, that's Calvinism.
Okay.
But that's actually a great question. It is something that is often discussed in IFB circles.
Yeah, I ask because in the Simpsons episode where I learned that the rapture was a thing in like 2004, Homer watches a movie called Left Below, which is a send-up of the Left Behind series, and there's a woman pushing a double-wide stroller with one seat empty, and she says, "The baby I decided to have baptized is gone."
So,
and there's
of
one
course,
baby left.
This is IFB theology, so baptism has no bearing on salvation. But what does come into effect is an IFB teaching called the age of accountability. So if we're taking the standard IFB position, or even the standard evangelical rapture believer position, everybody who is saved gets raptured, right?
Yes.
If you had died in that moment, you would have gone to heaven, means you get raptured when the rapture happens. But the IFB and many Christian evangelicals also teach that people who die before they are old enough to understand salvation go to heaven. And this is often referred to as the age of accountability. There is absolutely nothing about this in Scripture. It is based on a few different kind of piecemeal bits of Scripture. So their understanding of salvation and God's mercy. For non-Calvinist evangelicals can often lead them to believe that small children do not go to hell. One of the few places that it is hinted at in Scripture is King David's child with Bathsheba, who died as an infant. David in Scripture says, "He will not come to me, but I will go to him," expressing that he believes that he will meet his baby in heaven. Because of the whole biblical literalism thing, that is taken as truth, even though it's just David expressing an opinion.
And it's him expressing grief. It's not like David knows everything that God knows, so David knows all of the...
Right, but because they're biblical literalists, this is literally in there, and David said it, and God didn't correct him, I guess, so it must be true.
I sort of feel like if David knew exactly how to get into heaven and how not to get into heaven, I feel like he would have written it down.
Yeah, maybe in like the books and books of poetry that he wrote.
Yeah.
Also, I just heard Sarah J. Ruthless in my voice. I don't know if they know who I am, but I am a massive fan of theirs. And I just heard my sarcastic voice just sounded like them on TikTok. Anyway,
Aww.
So the general teaching is that at some point, by the way, if you don't follow Sarah J. Ruthless on TikTok, they do drunk Bible stories. They are fucking hilarious. And absolutely worth the follow.
Possible podcast guest in the future?
Ooh, I would love that. It would be like the time we had Heather Heath on and nobody thought I was funny for months because I had somebody so much funnier than me on the podcast.
I loved having Heather on as a guest.
I did back. Too.
Yeah.
Anyway. The general teaching among evangelical non-Calvinists is at some point in a child's life, they become capable of knowing right from wrong and purposely choosing wrong, like Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve chose to eat of the tree. Their eyes were opened to something they knew God commanded them not to do, and they purposely chose to go against God's commandment. And that rejection is what lost their souls. Wherefore as by one man Adam sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So the sin nature came into the world through that rejection of God. And just like that, a person is not culpable for their sin nature before they are capable of accepting or rejecting God.
So on one hand, this seems more compassionate, but on the other hand, this seems like also really f***ed up.
Yeah, and I'm going to explain some of why I think it's so messed up. Now, from a Calvinist viewpoint, it would vary wildly. I know there are a lot of Calvinists who would say that if anyone dies as a very small child, that's pretty good evidence that they were probably one of the elect to begin with. They have a lot of ways of trying to find God's compassion within that belief system and not feel like a tiny baby was born and then not elect and just doomed to hell the whole time. So the most common thought is that in non-Calvinist evangelicalism, children who die before they are capable of understanding right and wrong and salvation will always go to heaven. Which, one reason that this gets under my skin so bad is that I was told that an adult from somewhere else that isn't America who never hears the name of Jesus and is never presented with an opportunity to choose to accept or reject Jesus goes to hell. Which seems kind of fucking racist when you put it together that a white American baby that sadly dies in infancy or very early childhood is automatically taken to heaven because they never had a chance to accept or reject Jesus. But a brown person from somewhere else in the world goes to hell because they never had a chance to accept or reject Jesus, and someone should have witnessed to them.
Well, that's how you get people who want to be missionaries to like North Sentinel Island, which is like the uncontacted island where they're like, don't go here, leave them alone.
And I just don't get it, because if somebody who dies without having a chance to accept or reject Jesus goes to heaven, why mess that up? If there's an uncontacted people group, because racism and because money.
To guilt you it's to guilt you into being a missionary.
Anyway, so if anyone who would have gone to heaven had they died gets raptured, that would include all infants and very young children. I think the most logical way of thinking of the IFB point of view is all children who have not reached the age of accountability, who have not had the mental and emotional maturity to fully understand right and wrong and salvation. And that would include children born to saved parents as well as children born to unsaved parents, parents who were not raptured. It's really common in media about this to see a daycare or a newborn nursery where all of the children have suddenly disappeared at the time of the rapture.
They got to put that in there just to make sure.
Right. And that does seem nice, to have compassion on the poor, unsaved parents' children, but it actually opens up a lot of extra cans of worms that you wouldn't necessarily think of unless you were IFB. Number one, what about unborn children? What about people who are pregnant at the time of the rapture? So according to IFB teachings, lots of mainstream evangelical and even Catholic teachings, a fetus has a soul. And many of those groups would believe that a fetus has a soul before it's even a fetus, when it's just a zygote, like instance after sperm meets egg. Insolation, not insulation, insolation. That's the term for that, by the way, just in case you didn't know. Insolation. Yeah, ENSOULATION. I really like that word because this is something that's actually important to me to talk about, and it's a convenient word to have.
Also, public service announcement: there is an election this year, and make sure that you vote so that people who believe that zygotes get raptured because they have souls don't get to make decisions as to who has access to reproductive medicine. Just putting
Thanks
it
for that,
there.
Gabi. Yeah, definitely agree. But if a fetus has a soul under these belief structures, it is a person, and it is necessarily too young to understand right or wrong or salvation. So now, quote unquote, before the rapture, if a fetus dies via miscarriage or abortion or an accident or any other cause, they automatically go to heaven. And I feel like I've talked about this before, maybe in a Duggar episode. The IFB like to theorize about whether the baby will grow up in heaven and then meet their parents as an adult when the parents die, or whether the baby will remain a baby until the parents get to heaven so that the parents can raise it. As much as this is not a super relevant scriptural question, I find both options a nice and peaceful thought, and I support people thinking whatever helps if they have experienced pregnancy loss or the loss of a child. That is tragic, and you can imagine whatever you want in heaven, and I'm never going to judge you for that because that is a very difficult thing to go through. I'm going to get a little gross and gory with pregnancy talk here. The can of worms is, what about fetuses living inside unsaved people? So if there's a fetus living inside a saved person and they are raptured, then the saved person and the fetus both go to heaven. And then I guess God figures out if that person is still pregnant in heaven, or if there's just like a magical, it's 9 months old now and it's a baby, or if that fetus becomes an adult. God has to figure all that out.
Yeah, like, are people born in heaven? Can you be born in heaven?
It's a real tough question, because Jesus says in heaven there is no marrying or giving in marriage. So that would lead people to believe that there is no reproduction in heaven, which would make sense, because a kind of a part of the human contract with God is like sin and sin nature are a part of the human contract with God at this point, right? That is a keystone of how humans and God relate to each other. So after Armageddon, which we're going to get to, everybody who is ever going to be in heaven will live in heaven, unless you get into some of the paid debt theory of atonement stuff. But that's another can of worms that I don't have time for today. So I've been reading a lot about soteriology, and I may have gotten down some weird. So preterism has some interesting atonement views. That's all I can say right now. I'm going to come back to it. IFB teaching is, if somebody is saved, and pregnant, they definitely get raptured along with their fetus. But what if the pregnant person is not saved? The IFB teaching is, if somebody is pregnant and they are not saved and their fetus dies before birth, or their baby or very young child dies, that soul absolutely goes to heaven regardless of the salvation status of the parents. But that really, really gets messy when it comes to the rapture. Does a fetus living in an unsaved pregnant person get raptured?
And if it does, like, what physically happens?
Right.
So is it like gory? Is there like some like?
Yeah, like that's the question. Is how messy is this going to be, literally?
Or is it just going to be like fetus deletus?
But still, that could cause internal bleeding, because a placenta, even, if you're talking even a earlier first trimester or mid second trimester pregnancy, there's still a placenta that's attached to the inside of that person's uterus. The placenta would not be getting raptured because that's not a part of the baby. Let's say, so for example, let's say there is an unsaved woman who is pregnant with her third child. She's due in about a month, and she also has a 5-year-old child and a 2-year-old child. The IFB teaching would be that the 2-year-old absolutely gets raptured. They're too young to know right from wrong. The 5-year-old most likely got raptured, unless maybe they got unlucky and some kid at school told them about Jesus and they didn't get saved, in which case they're screwed. But what about the nearly full-term fetus? If the fetus is raptured, could that kill the mother? Because if the fetus just disappears, can she die of blood loss, or does the fetus get raptured through her abdomen and cause an injury?
Like Alien?
Yeah, like, and I'm not just trying to be gross. These are real questions that get asked. It's incredibly complicated, and no one has a scriptural answer. The only thing that they can say is, well, I trust that God is good and just, and God will do what is best. Another really big question that they ask all the time is, what if there are conjoined twins and one is saved and the other one is not? Like if Abby got saved and Brittany did not.
Ooh. Then
what? And the thing is that the IFB will hyperfixate on this sort of thing, and it's ridiculous in my opinion, because they say, well, we just have to trust that God is good and God is just. And then they will try to solve it in their human minds all day and all night. You believe in a God who can supernaturally tell the salvation status of every single person on planet Earth and perfectly choose all of the people who to rapture and who not to rapture, and perfectly orchestrate 7 years of a great tribulation, and knows who is and isn't saved and does not make a single mistake out of 8 billion people. But that God can't figure out what to do fairly with certain fetuses or conjoined twins.
I mean, it is kind of also like fan theory at this point.
Yeah.
You know, you go on the internet and you go onto like a forum where they're discussing, I don't know, like what's going to happen in the next Game of Thrones book. And it's all people coming out with their theories. And if you know, and there's like a consensus theory that everybody has that, oh, well, obviously this is what's going to happen in the next book because it's been foreshadowed so heavily. And you're like, well, the book's not out yet. How do you know that? And they're like, shut up. This is the consensus. We all know that this is what's going to happen. That's essentially what this is.
Yeah. I think something I've really been on lately is the IFB lack of faith in God because they will really posture having great faith in God. But to me, trying to figure this stuff out is a direct symptom of a lack of faith in God. Yeah, of course, you can't figure out what is fair if one conjoined twin is saved and the other one is not, and there is a rapture. Like, yeah, of course you can't figure that out. Like, who made you the judge?
My other thought is that, you know, when you have like hyper anxiety about something, like say you're anxious about, I don't know, like I'll pick something kind of low stakes that I'm kind of anxious about, which is what's going to happen with the NBA draft this year. Like where the Trailblazers going to end up in the draft? Who are they going to pick? Are they going to end up with somebody good that's going to be good for their team and they're going to win in the future? Are they not? Like, are they going to end up with a bad draft pick? I don't know that yet. And so one of the ways that I can kind of try to deal with that anxiety is go through and like make a draft board and like say, ooh, if we get this pick and this team's ahead of us, then they're probably going to pick this guy, which means that we pick this guy. Just go through every permutation of what could possibly happen. And that's kind of one of the ways that I
do stuff like that.
Yeah, like you do. I'm sure you do stuff like that. But like this is like crazy sports fan behavior.
I do stuff like that, but mine got a diagnosis.
Like, but normal people, like, they just be like, oh yeah, the draft's this week. I guess I'll watch that, you know?
Yeah.
Or like, I guess we just had the NFL draft when we're recording this. I just watched the NFL draft and I think the Eagles got some good guys. But that's kind of what I see here is that people are so anxious about the rapture is going to come. What if I'm not saved? That they're just like, I need to know the exact details of everything that's going to happen so that if it comes, that I'm like best prepared.
The other can of worms that we haven't gotten to yet is people with mental disabilities or mental differences. The IFB would teach, for example, some adults with Down syndrome would pass the age of accountability because everybody's capabilities are different. Some would be able to understand right from wrong and be responsible for accepting Jesus, or else they would go to hell. The IFB would also recognize that other adults with Down syndrome or another mental disability would never pass that mental and emotional threshold where they could understand this, and therefore they would go to heaven if they died at any age. Will adults with mental differences be raptured? Is this a case-by-case basis, like with older children, where God knows in every single case whether they have passed the threshold to be able to understand and be responsible for their own salvation? What about people who are considered brain dead and on life support at the time of the rapture? Like if the rapture had come when Terry Schiavo was alive, would she have been raptured? Or was her soul already at its final destination? So if it's a case-by-case basis, that is the most logical conclusion. If you're going to choose to believe in a rapture and you're going to choose to believe in a gracious and loving God who is always fair and just and does perfect justice every time, then believing that the rapture is a case-by-case basis makes the most sense. It's the most logical conclusion if you're going to start with that from that beginning point. I Googled it. There are approximately 2 billion children under the age of 14 in the world. My question is why God can perfectly righteously judge a case-by-case basis rapture for actual billions of children and fetuses and people with mental differences. Why can he not execute a case-by-case rapture or salvation plan for the people that the missionaries didn't get to? That one just feels so personal to me. That was the first deconstruction question I ever had. how do you square that with God is not willing that any should perish? And if God can perfectly execute a case-by-case basis rapture for actual billions of people, then why on earth can God not execute case-by-case salvation for people that missionaries didn't get to?
So I could see that if you're Christian and you believe in the rapture, but you also believe in God's love for the innocent above all else, it would be a logical conclusion that babies would get raptured. However, if you were a person who believes that the Bible is complete word of God and that it doesn't say specifically, then it's not going to happen. You might think otherwise, because if it were, then God would have made sure that that part was included just to make sure that everyone knows.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then there are a bunch of subsequent questions that come up, and reasonable people usually just come to, well, I'm thankful that God is smarter than I am, and whatever God decides will be perfectly just. But unreasonable people tend to resort to shouting matches and accusations of you're not a real fundamentalist over this sort of thing. And then when they're done, infighting about it, the whole thing about babies and small children being raptured ends up just being milked for trauma porn by these people. Even when I was in the Judgment Nights play that we talked about really early in the run of the podcast, I was playing a woman whose child had been raptured and was screaming and looking for her child.
Clearly, the baby being raptured is the compassionate thing, but also the mother being separated from her baby, that's not exactly compassionate. That's like a punishment.
Right. It's like an additional punishment, but that actually lines up fine with the Olivet Discourse, which says basically, woe unto people who are pregnant or nursing a baby at the time of the rapture. No, it doesn't say rapture. At the time of the day of the Lord, which may or may not be the rapture, as we are going to get to. I can't start that now. This is going to become...
Another rabbit trail.
I'm not starting. I'm not doing it.
Stay on the trail, Sadie. Stay on the trail.
There is no trail. We're in Revelation. It's just info dumping and trauma dumping from here to the end. So this brings up something that I do want to state here, because it's going to become more and more obvious as we go through the IFB teachings about the tribulation. This is all very much the IFB relishing and looking forward to the pain of the wicked. Especially when we look at a detail like this with that is not in Revelation at all, that is vaguely hinted at in the Olivet Discourse, and that is it. And then from that, we get this whole theology of babies and small children being raptured and the poor wicked parents looking for them everywhere and not understanding why they're gone. It's not about what's in the scripture. It's about relishing the pain of those left behind.
We've encountered this before when talking about fundamentalists. Also, I mean, you see it outside of fundamentalism as well, but it struck me as nothing more than just a way. Like, some people just have, like, I don't want to say a fetish for violence, but some people really just have a desire to see violence done to people who they don't like. And they're just like, when they see bad things happening to people they don't like, they're like, justice. Validated in a sanctioned way, and it's sanctioned through dogmatic legalism rather than just being like what it purely is, which is just I don't know how to describe it, but just like malevolence.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the Christian persecution narrative as well. So I want to dig one more layer into this relishing the pain of the wicked thing, though, because I think there's one more step we can go with that. I was thinking about this, and I remembered the debate about whether unborn babies would be raptured or whether newborns would be raptured or those under a certain age was actually a huge deal in the IFB. And you would think this question was focused on IFB children, like IFB parents wanting to know if their wife was pregnant at the time of the rapture, what would happen to their unborn child, or what would happen to our 2-year-old if we were raptured. But I remembered when having this debate at church, how much of it was focused on fetuses and small children of quote unquote unsaved parents. There's a legitimate reason for the IFB to have this debate out of concern for their own children. But when they have the debate, it isn't even phrased that way. It's simply phrased as a way to imagine the ultimate suffering of the unsaved. And my evidence for this is in the chick comics. There's one full-size chick comic that opens on a scene in a birthing hospital where the nurses see all of the babies in their little cots suddenly disappear. And I believe that is evidence that it's not a debate about whether our little IFB babies will be okay. It's a debate about how much will the wicked suffer.
The way I've personally experienced this has always been in the context of somebody evangelizing to me, that somebody will be speaking to me with a sense of superiority, and I'm trying to, find the right way. I'm trying to, how do I describe it? Like the closest thing I can liken it to, so when I was in driver's ed class, back when I was like 16, 17, we had a trauma nurse come in and talk to us about the dangers of injuries that could occur if you're driving, and telling us stories about people who had serious injuries from car accidents, which, were harrowing. But then she would go out and say outlandish things, like she thought that it should be mandatory minimum sentencing for speeding, and providing alcohol to a minor under the age of 21 should be a felony. That was kind of my experience with evangelizing too, is that when people talk in extremes like that, it just becomes so hard to take them seriously. But then when you don't, there's like a certain smugness. There's a certain attitude of like, oh, well, you'll be sorry you didn't listen to me. Oh, is my language too harsh for you? Well, you're going to be thinking about how you made the biggest mistake of your life when you're burning in hell. It's like, oh, what, do you need me to baby you through this concept that you should know already, that should be obvious to everybody who has a brain? Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. Like it's that kind of thing. You'll be sorry you didn't listen to me. And when you're about to be beheaded by the forces of one world government, or maybe when you're being beheaded by the sun visor in your car that you didn't fold all the way up, it'll be me that you're you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I really see the analogy there, because in the first part, it seems well-intentioned. Like, this is a terrible thing that can happen to you, and you can avoid it. That's how a lot of external IFB media about the rapture is framed. The tribulation is coming, it's going to be terrible, but you can avoid it. But the internal IFB media is more like the second half of that driver's ed lady's speech, in my opinion. The internal media, sermons about it preached to people who already believe in it, does very much gloat in the suffering that the wicked are going to experience.
Yeah, and it's just like every time I've experienced it, there's been like a self-centeredness, there's been like a narcissism to it. Like, it's almost like they don't want me to get saved, because so that they can be sure that like when you're being tortured, they're the one that you're thinking about.
Yeah.
So I'll be living in your head rent-free when you're being tortured for all eternity. Like, is that what you want?
Well, sure. Does that not sound like J. Frank Norris scooping a brain off the street?
Yeah.
Allegedly. Yeah, it's maybe a little humbling to hear from the other side, because I was indoctrinated several levels deep into this. I was indoctrinated as these are horrible, sad, terrible things that are going to happen to the wicked, and you should cry over them, and you should have your heart broken, and you should go try to get more people to come to Jesus. Because I was all of these levels deep in indoctrination. But I absolutely see how it can come off as, I hope you're thinking about me when you're being tortured. And of course, some IFB would literally say that.
I mean, I've literally had people tell me that.
Yes. I'm sure you have.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, what are we doing here? Do you want the best result, or do you want to just like punish people who didn't see your side of things? I mean, it's just like I saying I was right all along and you should have listened to me, and that's the thing that gets them off. Not like living a good life, not living like a happy life, and
yeah,
and getting to go to heaven or whatever. Is the relishing and the pain of the unbelievers a thing that necessitates a pre-trib rapture? Because my line of thinking is that if these awful things are going to be going on and everybody's going to be punished and they're all going to be thinking about, oh man, I should have gotten saved. That guy that came up to me and told me that I needed to get saved by Jesus, and he came to my door and I told him to go to hell. Well, now I'm in hell. It feels like it necessitates the people going through those awful things necessitates Christians not being around to experience it.
Not necessitates. I do think it seems more common from the pre-trib rapture set. I'm not going to speak too much to post-tribulation rapture beliefs in this episode. I will say that mid-tribulation rapture people, which does include subsets of the IFB, tend to look at it as we will endure tribulation, but we will not endure the bowls of the wrath of God. And this could be a very humble position, right? It could be, we will have to suffer because God is bringing great suffering on the earth to try to bring the last few people that are going to come to God to himself. And that could be a humble thing, or it could be a very prideful position of the end time believers are the strongest believers of all because we get to suffer for Jesus. And I'll let you guess which one it more often comes off as. So let's take up the offering. When we get back, we are finally going to get into the sealed judgments, which I intended to get into in the middle of the last episode.
Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
We are back from our break. And I'm just thinking, it's taken us so long to actually get into these sealed judgments. It's almost like how it takes forever every time they're like, oh, now we're at the end of the judgments. Just kidding. There's 7 more judgments, but that's what we keep doing.
Yeah. I really had to work on myself to not try to create a perfect Revelation series that talks about everything in the book of Revelation and every possible interpretation of it, because I would just need to do a different podcast to make that work. I'm trying to hit as much as I can while being entertaining and having fun and having a low number of panic attacks. So, Revelation chapter 5 for the sealed judgments, the IFB interpretation is in some cases going to be like it's what it says on the can, except for not, because there are parts of it that are literal but symbolic, but also literal, and the 4 horsemen are one of those things. Like, it's literal, but it's symbolic. They're not real horses, but it is literal, but it's symbolic.
So the horses aren't literal, but the scorpion horses are literal.
Right. The 4 horses in the first 4 seal judgments represent real things, but they aren't actually horses and riders, except for one of them, which is. But the scorpion horses are, they're scorpion horses. Don't you believe the Bible literally?
No comment.
So the first seal, white horse with a rider with a bow and a crown who goes forth conquering and to conquer. Conquering and to conquer is one of my favorite biblical phrases. It's just very satisfying to me.
It's kind of redundant, though. I mean, obviously, John of Patmos didn't read the Elements of Style.
If he was seeing all this like way into the future, he could have taken a break to read that. This white horse and rider is often interpreted as being the advent of the Antichrist. In pre-tribulation rapture thinking, this is usually interpreted to mean that the Antichrist will come to power on earth very shortly after the rapture. In the King James Version, this rider on a white horse is described as a crown was given unto him. And since the crown was given to him, that is usually interpreted either as God sets him up to take power and be the Antichrist, or he is given undeserved power by earthly powers so that he may become the Antichrist, which may have had something to do with the phrase stolen election. Possibly. So because of the association of the white horse with peace, it is often predicted that the Antichrist will come with a message of peace and unity, which is a small slice of the fundy hatred for the United Nations, because The Antichrist brings unity to the nations. So if the nations are united, then that's setting up for the Antichrist.
Well, if the Antichrist and the one world government is supposed to bring peace to the world, then we can be 100% sure that it isn't the United Nations.
True that.
It's
So this can get tied in with passages like Jeremiah 6:14, Jeremiah 8:11, Ezekiel chapter 13, where false prophets are often associated with a message of peace.
So this is where we get into the idea that it's a political allegory, because the figures being prophesized about in the book are possibly political figures.
Right. And so some historical figures that have been pointed to for the rider of the white horse are, of course, Nero, who is most likely who they're talking about when they say Antichrist anywhere in Revelation. It's also been hypothesized that this represents an age or an era rather than a person. So the preterist view is that almost all of it has already happened and happened very shortly after the crucifixion and resurrection. The historicist view is that most of it has happened, but it's kind of happened all throughout history. So the preterist view is usually, oh yeah, this is Nero. The historicist view is, this is probably the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire conquered.
So, like, there were 4 metals making up the robot in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and each of these represented a kingdom. It's like...
Right, but can I ask, why do you keep calling that a robot? This is like the 4th time this has happened.
Okay, excuse me. It's the Bionicle in Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
No, dude, I'm seriously asking, because in Christian tradition, it's just a statue. Like, you're talking about the thing in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that's like head of gold, chest of silver, legs of bronze, feet of clay, right?
Because I read different translations, and one of them said like a metal man, and I thought the metal man meant robot.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I looked it up. Most translations do say statue, although I think that the direct translation is image, as in like a graven image, like an idol.
Yeah, I went and checked the King James because you were tripping me out with that, and it is image in the King James.
I don't know. Like, I read there's a giant man made of metal, and I'm like, okay, robot.
Okay, that's the Gavi International version.
It's a bionicle. It's made out of protodermis.
Please do a Bible translation. Anyway, that's the first seal. The second seal is a red horse. The rider is given the power to take the peace from the earth and is given a great sword. This is most commonly interpreted as war in the futurist view, which is the IFB view. Usually this is seen as the Antichrist uniting many nations under his control to try to take over the whole world. Which is so weird to me, because in the IFB view, the rider on the white horse in the first seal is a literal guy, like a dude. And then the rider on the second horse in the very next seal, in like the very next verse in the same chapter, is not a literal dude. It's a concept. I just don't get it.
I mean, it just feels like they're trying to shoehorn something, so...
Right. It just frustrates me because the fundies can't even do biblical literalism right. The seal judgments, so some of them are interpreted in the futurist. So in the futurist view, some of them are interpreted as events, like moments or one-time occurrences. Like the sun goes black. It is one incident of the sun going black. It doesn't tell us how long it lasts, but it is one thing that happens one time. Riders and horses in the first 4 seals are interpreted more often as a set of events over a non-specific period of time. And this leads a lot of people to interpret the seal judgments and then certain of the trumpet judgments as overlapping in timeline. So the Antichrist comes on a white horse, and that lasts the entire 7 years of the tribulation. And then the second seal, war, starts at some point after the Antichrist has come into power, but that also lasts most of the rest of the tribulation. And then the third and fourth seal and all of the trumpet judgments follow along, but the first seal judgment with the white horse is still happening. By the way, historicist and preterist views often point to the end of the Roman Empire as the second seal judgment.
That's also going to be a problem. because there are also several possible dates for the fall of the Roman Empire, because there's 330 AD when the empire was split between East and West. There's 476 when the emperor was deposed. There's 1453 when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans. And then there's the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, which occurred in the Napoleonic Wars of 1806. So there are also some who contend that the Roman Empire never fell because the Roman Catholic Church still exists, but this is an extremely fringe belief.
So all of those dates that you just gave for the different falls of the Roman Empire, all of those are things that historicists might latch onto and say, oh, that was the third trumpet or whatever.
Or if you had some other fringe belief, then one of those dates could be something to do with the numerology that you would use to calculate the date of the rapture coming or whatever.
So the third seal, a black horse with a rider who has scales in his hand. The futurist view is that there will be famine. This is referenced in the song, I Wish We'd All Been Ready. There's that lyric, a piece of bread could buy a bag of gold. So that's referring to the third seal, the famine. The preterist view was, very interestingly, places this as a famine that happened under the Roman Emperor Claudius, beginning around the years 41 to 44 CE. And just to back out and set this up, Revelation was written sometime around 80 to 100 CE. So if we're looking from the perspective that this is a coded message describing a lot of things that have already happened and then predicting the end of the story, this is a famine that the author might well have remembered, but the target audience would have also either remembered this famine from having lived through it or at least heard stories about it from their parents. And this famine in around 41 to 44 CE also led directly to the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE, which you may recall was the event that Jesus prophesied as this is the end of the world. This is the end times. And Jesus said, this generation will not pass until this be fulfilled. And that thing happened almost exactly 40 years after Jesus prophesied that it would happen, which is in the Bible, 40 years is a generation. Kind of feels like, you don't have to believe that he's the Son of God to believe that he made a good guess. Or that if you are not a believer in Jesus at all, you could look at it as, this was written after the destruction of the Second Temple, and they retconned Jesus prophesying it to make him look cool.
There we go.
Like, that's one way of looking at it. If you're a believer, you might say, Jesus made a good prophecy. Good job. There are all sorts of ways of looking at it, depending on what worldview lens you want to use. But Jesus tied the end times and the end of days to the destruction of the Second Temple, which is a thing that happened, and we know exactly when it happened. Futurists will like to get around this by saying that Jesus wasn't actually talking about the temple. He was talking about his body that would be destroyed via crucifixion.
Right, and then this theology, Jesus replaces the temple, and so his sacrifice undoes the need for the ritual sacrifices to be happening in the temple.
Right.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I'm just saying, preterism is looking real good right now. But that's actually going to change by the end of the episode.
Good times.
Oh, yeah. So, fourth seal, fourth seal is a pale horse with a rider representing death, who is given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword, hunger, death, and beasts of the earth. The futurist literalist interpretation is that exactly 25% of the world's population die because of war and hunger and death and wild animals. I saw a really unusual interpretation actually about the 4 horsemen while I was doing research for this episode. One guy said, actually, this isn't 4 horsemen. This is the same rider on 4 different horses. They all represent the Antichrist. So the Antichrist brings peace and then brings war and then brings famine and then brings death. I thought that was really interesting because the view I grew up with in the IFB is that the first rider is the Antichrist, but the other 3 are symbolic and not real people. And the idea that it's just one guy doesn't fit the text very well, but it is a lot more logical than the IFB interpretation. So I found that interesting. The preterist view of the famine and death and war is the famine led up to the Great Jewish Revolt, which led to the destruction of the Second Temple, which fits Jesus's prophecy. The idealist view really caught my interest here. So you might remember that idealism is the idea that all of Revelation is an analogy that is, it's a story about the way that humans hurt each other and the great battle of good against evil. In the idealist view, war and famine and death represent the destruction that mankind inflicts on each other because they reject God's will.
During the bubonic plague, did people believe that they were living through the end times, or was that not like, it was the rapture and the end times not like a Christian belief at that time?
Ooh, well, the rapture was not a Christian belief at that time, which we are going to get into in about 2 more episodes, and it is going to be so interesting. The end times were a Christian view at the time, but I am not sure.
Right, because like a third of the population of Europe died in the bubonic plague. Something crazy. Like, do any historicists believe that the bubonic plague was one of the 4 horsemen?
I don't know, but that is totally possible. Or even that it's not one of the 4 horsemen. There's a trumpet judgment where everybody gets boils. So if you're a historicist, you might tie those things together. The official stance of the Catholic Church was that the plague was divine in origin.
Really?
Uh-huh. Because the church was losing its authority, and the plague was attributed to God pouring out his wrath and punishment upon mankind. This is according to a person on Reddit who does seem to know what they're talking about.
So take it with a grain of salt, but also that's an interesting...
Yeah, it does have sources. I just don't have time to go through and check every one of them.
Yeah. 5th seal. Are we going on to the 5th seal now?
Oh, 5th seal?
If I remember, David Koresh was obsessed with the end times, and he believed that they were living in the end times. And he said that they were on the 5th seal right now. The 4 horsemen had come. They were on the 5th seal.
Yeah, and the 5th seal is martyrs. So that makes
Which makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems like a David Koresh thing. Yes. 5th seal. John sees the souls of the martyrs under the altar in heaven. In the IFB, this is commonly interpreted as there's gonna be martyrs. I do think this is important to know exactly who these martyrs are in the pre-tribulation futurist way of looking at things. So if you believe that everybody who is saved is raptured at the time of the rapture, who is a Christian that's getting killed during the tribulation? Well, these are people like the characters in the Left Behind movies. People who were not saved at the time of the rapture and were left behind, but then decided to get saved. These people are elsewhere referred to as the remnant or multiple different ways. There is a question about who can be saved after the rapture. And this is actually a major point of rapture trauma for a lot of IFB kids. And I think this is a good place to explain it while we're talking about the martyrs during the tribulation. 1 Thessalonians talks about maybe the rapture. And there's a clarification about the day of the Lord, which may or may not be the rapture or the second coming or neither or both in 2 Thessalonians 2 verses 6 through 12. This passage talks about the, quote, man of sin, the son of perdition, who sits in the temple and believes that he is God. He comes in the power of Satan and he can work wonders and do miracles. This is very often interpreted as referring to the Antichrist from Revelation, and that the Antichrist sitting in the temple is the abomination of desolation, which we're going to get to. In this passage, Paul says that after the coming of the Antichrist, and presumably after the rapture, a strong delusion will be sent onto the minds of those who believed not the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. In the IFB, this is interpreted as, after the rapture, those who had heard the gospel and rejected it before the rapture will have a strong delusion and not be able to get saved. Even if they tried to get saved, the Holy Spirit would not allow them to get saved.
See, that's interesting, because when I hear believe not the truth but had the pleasure in unrighteousness, and strong delusion, I think of people who follow like a demagogorous leader who encourages them to buy into their deepest prejudices and take pleasure in violence and hate. Like who have pleasure in unrighteousness. That's what I think of, is having pleasure in unrighteousness is like
that's a theory.
It's not buying into your base instincts of like hedonism. It's buying into your base instincts of hatred and prejudice.
So the IFB belief is anyone who explicitly had a chance to get saved before the rapture and chose not to will not be able to be saved after the rapture. People who didn't have that explicit opportunity can still be saved after the rapture. This is not shown in the Left Behind film. You may remember the main character was given a chance to get saved because her husband was getting saved just shortly before the rapture happened, and she chose not to, but she was still able to be saved after the rapture. In a lot of IFB teachings, that would not have been possible. She could have tried to get saved, but would never have been able to. This is really important in end times fiction because it will often be a plot point that there's a Christian pastor before the rapture, and the rapture came and he didn't get raptured because he wasn't really saved, but now he's trying to pray and get saved and he's realizing that he's going to go to hell no matter what. Or in some fiction, someone who got saved or someone who knew the gospel before the rapture but did not get saved is now unable to be saved, but is now selflessly trying to help other people get saved so that they don't go to hell with them. This gets played a lot in Rapture media. I think it's really important to discuss because it's a big source of trauma for IFB kids. And if you think about it, IFB kids have had the explicit chance to be saved. And all of us did at 1 or 2 or 3 or more points, get saved, pray the prayer, believe that we meant it with all of our hearts, get baptized, the whole 9. But sermons about hell or the rapture are notorious for causing IFB kids and teens, and adults often, to get scared and doubt whether they really believed when they got saved, especially for those of us who got saved at a very young age. 3 or 4 is incredibly common in hardcore IFB kids. So then kids end up terrified that their salvation didn't take, or that they didn't believe it enough. And they think if the rapture comes, they might not be raptured. But if that happens and they get left behind, they would also not be able to accept Jesus after the rapture because of this weird rule, and they would be doomed to tribulation and hell. I think this is one of the absolute biggest things that terrifies IFB children about the rapture, because it's not just you might get left behind, it's you might get left behind, and if that happens, there's no takesies backsies. If you realize one day that the rapture has happened and you didn't go up, there's no changing it, you're doomed forever. God is going to send you a strong delusion so that you literally can't get saved.
That seems so analogous to so many other things in the IFB, like you can follow all the rules and mean everything in your heart and grow up and be an IFB pastor, follow Jack Hyles' church manual to the letter, and that doesn't guarantee your success.
And what they'll tell you is, well, if you prayed and meant it, then you are going to heaven and you have nothing to worry about. And that is just so consistently unsuccessful to calm little IFB kids. And it just, everybody I know freaked out about this. So I think that's important when we're talking about martyrs, because the general IFB way of looking at Revelation is that many people will be saved after the rapture, that many people will turn to God upon seeing the judgments. And we're going to talk in a minute about certain people being sealed, God sealing Christians in their forehead. So putting a secret mark on the forehead of Christians that only other Christians can see, which is the flip side of the mark of the beast, which we will get to, where the Antichrist has all people marked with a 666 or something similar to it. Everybody is sealed to either God or the Antichrist, and that Christians will be persecuted and killed in mass numbers after the rapture, separate from all the people who are killed by the the earthquakes and the death and the wild animals and the famine and all that stuff. Lovely thought for IFB kids. Sixth seal. There is a great earthquake on Earth. The sun temporarily goes black. The full moon appears to become blood, and stars fall to Earth. The futurist view on this one is exactly what it says on the can. There are geologic and cosmic events. Futurists might give some guesses about what causes these events. We are still in the era of the second seal, the Antichrist coming to military power. So some futurists might guess and say that this is a nuclear war that causes dust and debris to block out the sun. Some might say that the earthquake causes volcanic eruptions or dust clouds big enough to block the sun, and that's why the sun temporarily goes black and the full moon appears to be blood. There are different theories about how it happens, but it's taken very literally among literalist futurists.
This seal is the one I think I see the most people talking about looking for the signs of, just because the signs are distinct, but they're also general. Like, they're events that are general enough that you can point to something happening, or you can point to a general condition that exists in the world. It's kind of a bit of confirmation bias here, where if you're looking for it, you're going to see it.
So anytime there's an earthquake or an eclipse, people tend to start thinking of this.
Yeah.
I would note that the preterist view of the fifth and sixth seals are like, this is God's, refer to relations between the Roman Empire and Jews around 70 to 80 CE. And it's pretty gross. It's just like your standard Jews killed Jesus stuff, which is disappointing because so much of preterism makes more sense than that. But one historicist view is that this is the metaphor for the final collapse of the Roman Empire, so like after Constantine, which I did find more interesting than boring garden variety bigotry. So at this point between the sixth and seventh seal, 144,000 witnesses are sealed to God, as I was talking about a moment ago. God will protect them from the wrath to come, and they will prophesy and try to help people get saved during the remainder of the tribulation. This is where the literalism really goes off the rails. The text specifies that these are Jewish witnesses and that they are virgins, 12,000 exactly from each of the 12 tribes, except for not Manasseh, for reasons I can't remember.
Rip.
Not.
It's because his descendants invented Manischewitz, and so.
Why would you be cursed for that?
No, you got too many people drunk. The IFB don't like alcohol.
Right.
Yeah.
So not just the IFB, but a lot of different branches of literalists are very literal about the 144,000. But there are so many different opinions. I got a little bit distracted reading about all of these opinions. So I found David Jeremiah said they're literally Jewish, but they're not literally virgins, because that's just meant to represent purity. And I don't know why one would matter and the other one wouldn't. I don't understand why one would be literal and the other would be figurative. There are people who say, well, no, they're not literally Jewish or literally virgins, and there's not literally 144,000 of them either. This is referring to all of the people of God who are saved during the tribulation, that God will mark and seal all of them to be witnesses and to be to prophesy for God.
The 144,000, that's also an important belief for Jehovah's Witnesses, if I do recall correctly.
Right. So in Jehovah's Witness beliefs, it used to be literally exactly 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses that will rule and reign with Jesus after the tribulation. And I think they've adjusted that number. And I also...
Right, because they've got more members than that now. I can imagine if you were just starting out, they're like, we need to get to 144,000 members.
And then they got to like 140,000 and they thought, oh no, what do we do now? And I haven't looked deeply into it, but I'm pretty sure it's changed a couple times. In the IFB, it's usually interpreted completely literally. I remember I went and checked the Left Behind books, and in the Left Behind books, it is also literal. There are more than 144,000 Christians who become saved after the rapture. This is referring to actually exactly 144,000 male Jewish virgins who get super excited about Jesus and want to get everybody else super hyped on Jesus too.
That sounds kind of problematic, but also I kind of want to read how these 144,000 Jewish male virgins are depicted.
That's literally about it. That's like all we know about them.
Hey, I'm Ben Goldman and I'm majoring in computer science. Like it's not
No, it's literally just there's 144,000 of them and they're super hyped on Jesus, which when you say it that way does seem kind of sus.
What are they out here doing? Are they like all hanging out together like in a club? Like you follow the BYU Virgin Club?
In the Left Behind books, I think they meet up in a soccer stadium.
That must be a big soccer stadium.
Yeah, not the one Alberto Rivera preached in.
No.
Definitely not that one. Man, that was a cool investigation. Anyway.
I missed that. We should do another one.
Yeah, we need one as a treat for finishing Revelation. So another theory, the theory that it refers to all of God's people is 144,000 is 12 times 12 times 1,000. And the number 12 is associated with completion in scripture. So 12 times 12 is completion by completion. And then the number 1,000 is sometimes interpreted literally, but sometimes interpreted to mean an uncountable number or many. So a lot of people, another theory is that 144,000 means all of the witnesses that the world needs, or even all of God's people, with virginity being symbolic of everyone who has been saved or made new by the gospel.
Because 144,000 is roughly 1% of the worldwide Jewish population. And I guess if it's all men and it's no women, then it's 2% of all Jewish men. Clearly, it's not the ones that went to sleepaway camp, and none of them went to sleepaway camp. But
right.
Anyway, seventh seal. Here we go. Seventh seal is the trumpet judgments, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the silence in heaven for about half an hour. A lot of people interpret this as the middle point of the 7-year tribulation. Weirdly, that was not anywhere in the text at all. I checked the Left Behind plot summaries. The Left Behind series actually has the midpoint of the tribulation happening towards the end of the trumpet judgments. I don't know why anybody would see this as the middle point of the tribulation, but apparently some people do. Let's take up the offering one more time. We're going to come back, trumpet judgments, mark of the beast, 2 witnesses, and more.
Hey Brian, do you know anyone that was once a teenage fundamentalist?
Oh, Troy, you know that I was, because you and I have a podcast called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
I did know that. But you know what I find myself asking these days?
No, I don't, but I think you're going to tell me.
What about all those things that church gave us definite answers for? What are we supposed to think about all those things now?
Well, funnily enough, that's what we're doing for Season 5 of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Ooh, Brian, I sense the Lord at work here.
He works in mysterious ways. And we are going to unpack these things. We're going to find out what we do think about them now.
So tune in to Season 5 of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, the official podcast for the Azusa Street Revival.
I'm not quite sure that's true, but it is available wherever you get your podcasts.
We are back from our break. We've gotten through the 7 seals. I guess we haven't gotten through the 7 seals because the 7th seal is like its own.
The 7th seal
dealio.
Is all the trumpets and the silence. It seems like people who believe in mid-tribulation rapture often agree with the Left Behind series and place the rapture and the midpoint of the tribulation after the conclusion of the 7 trumpet judgments.
So how do they get here? Do they figure that the trumpet judgments are like general conditions and they take longer?
No, because the bowls, otherwise referred to as vials, specifically contain the wrath of God. 7 bowls of the wrath of God are poured onto the earth. And there are verses elsewhere about believers being spared from God's wrath specifically. So this interpretation looks at the seal and trumpet judgments as God saying, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy. This is your last chance to get saved. And then whoever doesn't listen gets hit with the wrath. So the seal and trumpet judgments are to convince any last hangers on to please get saved now. And then the bowl judgments are no longer to try to convince people. The bowl judgments are just God's wrath and punishment. So believers are spared from the wrath, but not from the tribulations leading up to it.
Okay, so everything after that, it's just for the unbelievers. So
Right.
it's like more direct action doesn't take as long.
Right. And then it would tie back in with that thing about how if you aren't saved before the rapture, when you had a chance, you can't get saved after the rapture. As much as I hate to admit it, mid-trib rapture makes a lot more sense.
Don't let your dad hear you saying that. If there's an earthquake in Mobile, Alabama,
It's my dad rolling over in his grave. Yep.
it might be the one that is starting the what is it, the 5th seal?
My dad would be super honored by that.
Yeah.
No, there's no specific reason to think that the verse in 2 Thessalonians is specifically about the rapture because it doesn't. Sorry, I'm grabbing one of 3 Bibles off my shelves. The verse in 2 Thessalonians doesn't say it's about the rapture. It says it is about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together unto him. So the verses in 2 Thessalonians don't specify that they're about the specifies that it's about the rapture, but it also ties the rapture to the coming of Jesus, which people who believe in the rapture think happens twice. Like Jesus comes in the clouds and raptures everybody and then goes back up to heaven for 7 years and then comes back down for the whole Armageddon thing. That's really not in scripture. Like the idea that Jesus is gonna beam everybody up to him is in there. The idea that Jesus is coming back from heaven back to here on earth where we live is in there. What's not in there is the idea that those are 2 different things, or that one of them happens before the tribulation and one of them happens after it, or that the tribulation is 7 literal years. Like all of that is extremely, the idea that Jesus is coming and he's going to beam us up is in there. But all of this stuff about it being exactly 7 years and the tribulation and the rapture part is coming at this point in the tribulation is so not in there. This verse in 2 Thessalonians that seems to be talking about the Antichrist and the delusion that will come on people during the time of the Antichrist so that they can't get saved is definitely tied to the end times, but it's not tied directly to the rapture because the rapture is barely in there. I'm not even making sense. The Olivet Discourse is extremely pro mid-trib rapture. And somebody on Twitter is going to assassinate me over this, but Revelation is extremely pro post-tribulation rapture. I'm sorry.
So if the textual evidence for a pre-trib rapture is so scant, then why does the
bad. It's so bad.
Why does the IFB believe it so vehemently?
I have no idea.
Like, I remember...
I mean, probably Millerism, but we're going to get there.
So, like, I remember when we were... And this isn't IFB, this is Southern Baptist Convention. We were talking... I was watching a speech by Jerry Falwell. And Jerry Falwell was talking about how important it was to be pre-trib rapture. But then he's like, but I have a friend who's mid-trib, but he's still a good Christian. And I think that I'm not going to cancel him over that. I'm like... Cool, I guess. I don't know. It seems to me that with a pre-trib rapture, it's easier to like scare people. It's easier to say it could come any day without warning. So that serves as like a distinct functional advantage and saying you're going to see the signs and you'll know. And that's when you know that you got to get right with God. Like then you'll be like, okay, I can chill for a little bit.
Right. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is saying, that he is coming back and that's all over the Gospels. But the idea that the coming back and the rapture and the second coming and the Armageddon are all separate events that happen at different times on a very particular schedule is what is really, really not in there. And I really feel that this pre-trib rapture is to instill a sense of urgency. It's a sales technique, because Revelation is very supportive of post-trib rapture, and the Olivet Discourse is extremely supportive of mid-trib rapture, and that kind of blew my mind.
It is a real motivator to get as many people saved as quickly as possible. And if it doesn't I guess it's a motivator for the people you're sending out as missionaries, because it's like, well, you don't know how much time you got left to do this. It's not like you're going to see a sign and you're going to be like, okay, time to wrap this up. Now we got to like really beat it and really pound the pavement. It just doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if you wear your body out and if your mind is like totally worn out, totally destroyed, because when it comes, you're going to get your new, your heavenly body, your sanctified, purified body, whatever it is, your glorified body.
Right.
Which sounds kind of Mormon, but cool.
Jesus says that he's coming back, but he doesn't even know when. Only God the Father knows. Jesus also said the end times are coming within a generation of now, which would be around 70 CE. And the thing that he prophesied would happen, which is the destruction of the second temple, did actually happen. So it totally makes sense if you're believing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, all of that stuff. He made a good prophecy. He was correct. The second temple was destroyed. If you believe anything other than that, the people who were writing the Gospels retconned Jesus into predicting it exactly on time, because the destruction of the second temple had already happened at the time that the Gospels were written. And these people were saying, oh yeah, we should have Jesus predict that, because that'll prove to people that what I'm writing is true. It kind of Forrest Gump Jesus into recent history. Either way that you look at it, that totally makes sense. Jesus promised a second coming, but Jesus does not tie that event to the rapture, because Jesus does not predict the rapture. Jesus only predicts that he is coming back and that the end of times will come eventually. So the workaround for the futurist is that the rapture isn't actually technically the second coming. The rapture, Jesus comes in the clouds, but he doesn't touch down on the earth. He just stops by to beam up all the believers. And then 7 years later is actually the second coming, where Jesus touches down on earth, fights Satan, defeats the Antichrist, and ushers in the millennium.
It also strikes me as something that you could retcon in. Like, if your followers are asking too many questions about stuff that you said was going to happen and hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
When there's, okay, so Jesus is dead. Jesus died. When's he coming back? What's going on with that? Well, then you can kind of just like put something in there to kind of placate them. And now it's 2,000 years later and it's kind of spiraled wildly out of control. And you're like, I guess we're keeping this
movies
thing,
made
like,
about it. And I'm with you. So all of these events are referenced in scripture. That's one way of saying it. The idea of everybody getting beamed up to Jesus is referenced in scripture in several different ways. It is not nearly as explicit as the fundamentalist would have you believe. It's not nearly as clear as they would have you believe. But the idea that Jesus is going to beam up believers at some point is in there. The idea that Jesus is going to come back and defeat the forces of evil and usher in good forever is in there. When you pull together all of these different prophetic and supposedly prophetic verses from Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Matthew, Thessalonians, Revelation, etc., I think there's some in like Philemon, I don't know. The thing is, the timeline is absolutely not laid out clearly. And people want you to think that it is laid out clearly, and it is not. Even as I was reading through Revelation for this episode, I noticed that some things are seemingly out of order in the text. For example, the two witnesses, which we're just about to get to, appear between the 6th and 7th trumpet judgments, and they are on earth for 1260 days, which is 3.5 years, 42 months. Nobody really seems to think that the two witnesses start after the 6th trumpet judgment. and then are done before the seventh trumpet judgment, because that would mess up the timeline. So canonically, in the text, we've gotten through 6 trumpet judgments, and then the text is telling us, oh yeah, by the way, at some point these 2 witnesses turned up and they were there for exactly 1260 days. And then after the 1260 days, exactly, they are killed by the Antichrist. This makes taking the text literally a real barrier to taking the text literally.
Unless all of the bowl judgments happen really quickly, so all of the 3.5 years that the witnesses are there, like the 3.5 right at the end.
Yeah, but that wouldn't fit with the 144,000 witnesses, which are related to the 2 witnesses, unless they're not. There are timeline issues here, and you remember the silence in heaven for half an hour between the 6th and the 7th seals that leads into the 7 trumpets. Even some of the literalist futurists don't believe that the silence is a literal half hour, because the text says about a half an hour. So some futurists believe that this could be a longer pause between the tribulation and the Great Tribulation. So it could be that you have 3.5 years of tribulation and then a break for a year or whatever, and then 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. Some partial preterists would believe that we are still in the silence between the tribulation and the Great Tribulation. So all of the first 6 seal judgments have happened, but the trumpet judgments haven't happened yet.
So I guess I better get out my stopwatch and start timing a half an hour.
This is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. I am so lost. I read this book, this Revelation, like back a couple of times, and I'm still confused.
Don't worry, I've read it dozens of times, and I am just as confused. So, first trumpet, hail and fire mixed with blood. The fire burns 1/3 of the trees and all of the grass on the earth. Second trumpet. I'm breezing through these judgments because the events around the trumpet judgments tend to get more attention from people who want to interpret and make predictions, and I have covered this already. Second trumpet, something like a great mountain on fire is cast into the sea. 1/3 of the sea becomes blood, 1/3 of sea life dies, 1/3 of ships are destroyed. I found an interesting interpretation on this one. If a meteor is large enough and landed in the ocean, the steam and the water displacement from it landing in the sea would cause pretty much worldwide tsunamis. So that would account for how all the ships get destroyed by this event, although it doesn't account for the water turning to blood. That is actually an interesting practical interpretation. But are we starting to understand why all of the ex-fundies are terrified of meteors, space, earthquakes, the ocean, natural disasters, storms, hail, and trumpets?
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that Americans living in the Midwest or like in the South or like California, wherever you're living, might deal with hailstorms frequently. Those are things that happen here.
It was hailing on my window when we started recording this episode, and now it's sunny again.
But like if you live in Kansas, hail all the time. If you live in like Ohio, hail, like they have hail all the time. And like I don't know, you're from the Gulf Coast. What's the name of the Alabama football team? The Crimson Tide. So if you're like, if it's the ocean turning red from time to time. No, but like, and if you're from California, you might experience an earthquake pretty frequently. Like none of these things are particularly common in the part of the world where Christians were living. Like the Levant is a semi-arid region where it doesn't rain frequently, and there's also more likely to be a flash flood than there is to be like casual showers just generally happening. I mean, I don't know. It is quite geologically stable as well. So a weather event or a geological event that happens a few times a year in America is something that's going to be a serious event in that part of the world. It's just like...
So third trumpet, a great burning star called wormwood falls on the rivers, and 1/3 of the rivers are made bitter and undrinkable. Fourth trumpet, 1/3 of the sun and 1/3 of the moon and 1/3 of the stars are darkened. Fifth trumpet calls back to Satan's fall from heaven. The bottomless pit, presumably hell, is opened and smoke comes out. And out of the smoke come our favorite locust, scorpion, horse buddies.
Love them. Can I get one as a pet?
Yeah, but we still don't know if they're like 2 inches tall or if they're horse-sized.
I mean, if they're horse-sized, then you could ride them. And that would be kind of cool.
But I think the 2-inch ones would be really cute.
Could ride one, play like a cool guitar solo while riding one. That'd be cool for a music video.
Yeah. Okay. I have a note though. In the fifth trumpet, the bottomless pit is opened and smoke comes out, and then out of the smoke of the pit come the locust, scorpion, horse guys. Okay, I saw the word pit, and it's clearly referring to hell because it does talk about, it references the fall of Satan. But I was wondering what the original language was on this. So I did check, because of course I did. And I found something really interesting. Okay, Revelation chapter 9, verse 1 and 2 from the King James. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. This is actually the first place in the entire King James Version that the phrase bottomless pit appears. This is the only place, Revelation is the only place in the New Testament that uses the word pit for hell. In the entire rest of the New Testament, pit is only used to refer to a literal finite hole. As we discussed in our episode on hell, pit is often used to refer to hell in the Old Testament, but the words in Hebrew are usually Sheol, sometimes bore. So this verse is from Revelation and was written in Greek. The words are literally translated as pit of the abyss. The term bottomless comes only from the context of, that word that is translated abyss in English is related to the idea of Sheol, and Sheol kind of has the connotation of being bottomless or infinite. Bottomless is not in there. It is not in the Greek. Holy shit. This is the verse that is used to make us believe that people who go to hell will be falling forever in the bottomless pit. You remember talking about this in the wormhole to hell, well to hell episode? The belief that hell is a place of constant falling because it is a bottomless pit. This is the only hole.
It's not even in there.
This blew my mind. It blew my mind. This is the Revelation is the only place in the Bible that the phrase bottomless pit appears. When you check the Greek, the word bottomless is not in there. It just says abyss. Bottomless is only in there because of incredibly vague connotation. Falling forever in the bottomless pit is 100% not in the Bible.
This is crazy because when I read that passage, my thought was, well, of course, the bottomless pit is that the scary monsters come out of. That's hell, right? Like that's of course.
Yeah, this is absolutely referencing hell. It's just that bottomless is kind of a weird, not in their translation.
But that's like, I guess I also have like the cultural connotation of hell, which is, but like it's, Dante's Inferno, which is, from the Greek or the Roman katabasi, which were popular theories of the afterlife during this period in Judea. And then if I go back and remember that the root source material for Christians' conception of hell is extra biblical and it comes outside of monotheistic tradition, then the only things that, and this is like the only thing that we get in the Bible that references literally the...
Right. And even if you read Dante, I don't think Dante references it's not bottomless. It's a pit or a hole or a big ass cave, right?
Right.
But there isn't that connotation of bottomless, and that only comes from extra scriptural relation to the idea of Sheol, which is kind of connotated as being kind of bottomless because it's a realm of the dead and not super literal of a place. It's more of a state of being as opposed to a location in the physical world. Yeah, falling forever in the bottomless pit, not in the Bible. Congratulations to everybody who just felt like a 100-pound backpack was taken off their shoulders, because I did. That is the hardest deconstruction I have done in years.
On mic.
Yeah.
On mic. Yeah.
I am just so happy.
Judaism is a religion. It's noteworthy because it's kind of vague and non-specific about the afterlife and like destinations. So it really leaves it up to people to say what happens when we die. And then the Greeks and Romans come in with their theory, and people are just like, why not? Sure. Why not? That, you know, and then fast forward a few hundred years, it's getting referenced in Revelation. And then fast forward 1,200 years, it's getting written about by Dante. And then fast forward 700 years, and we're reading into it about predictions of the literal end of days and what's literally going to happen. And people are literally like, I'm going to fall into literally a bottomless pit and never stop falling. And I'm going to keep falling and falling and falling and falling and falling and falling. And it's never going to stop. But also I'm going to be being stabbed by little gremlin guys with a poker, like a fiery hot poker or something. And
yeah. So, what were we saying? Sixth trumpet.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's the fifth trumpet.
The scorpion locust
horses
they're coming out of the pit.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sixth trumpet. 4 angels, which were prepared for an hour, a day, a month, and a year, are loosed from the river Euphrates to slay another third of mankind. There are also 200 million horsemen.
That's a lot of horsemen.
And it's not clear, like, what are these angels or demons or bad people? Very unclear. Released from the Euphrates River.
Well, if one of them's been prepared for an hour, he's probably not that good at killing people. So that's probably why they only got, what was a third of the people?
Or is it they were prepared for 1 year, 1 month, so 13 months and 1 day and 1 hour? Or were they prepared, is that saying they were prepared for a certain time?
Oh, okay, yeah. So
like for
you're
the
saying
hour,
that,
the
like,
minute, and the second that they were supposed to be there.
You're saying that, like, you know, you go to police school and you get your police certification after, like, police academy, or were they Angel Killing People Academy? And Angel Killing People Academy goes 1 year, 1 month, 1 hour, and 1 day.
Right. Or does the People Killing Academy for Angels prepare you for a day and a month and a year and an hour? So 4:00 p.m. on April 29th, 2024. A month, a day, a year, an hour, a time.
Either that, or I'm thinking that there's one of them that's like been like, I've been working for a year on this, and this guy been like, I've been working for a month, and then there's another guy who's been like, I've been working for like a day on this, like, and there's another guy who's like, oh, I just got here like 45 minutes ago. When are we going? 15 minutes from now? Okay, we're good. Like,
yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sixth trumpet. 4 angels and 200 million horsemen of unclear origin and unclear preparation time are released from the Euphrates River to kill another third of the people remaining alive on Earth, with the smoke and brimstone and fire that comes out of their mouths. And also, the horses' tails are like snakes and can bite people.
Ow. This...
We've gone too long.
This is so silly. I'm sorry. This
is where it goes off the rails. And so the next thing that happens after the 7th trumpet here is there's a break. And you remember I told you about the angel comes down with a little scroll in his hand, and then John has to eat the scroll.
It gives him a little bit of, he needs some Pepto because he's got an upset stomach, a little antacid.
It makes his stomach hurt, yeah. I have a 3-year-old. What came to my mouth was, it gives him a tummy ache.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a break, actually, for our episode there, because when we come back, we're going to talk about...
bowl judgments.
Yeah, the 7th trumpet.
Everything bad gets a whole lot worse.
Everything bad gets worse and more confusing, because we go back in time, question mark, to the woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet who is being in labor with a child, and the dragon and the Antichrist and the beast and somebody who's got 7 horns and 10 heads and might be Rome. And then after all of that, we get into the bowl judgments where everything gets worse, and then Armageddon. Yeah, it's going to be fun.
All right. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. It's been fun recording with you. We will be back. I don't know what we're talking about next week. I don't think we're going to continue this topic next week because we want to try to.
This is really heavy deconstruction. I am having fun, and I think our listeners are too, but I want to give people the option for a break. We're going to come back with a surprise episode next week. I have some ideas.
It's a surprise because we don't know what it is yet.
It's a surprise to us.
It's a surprise to us. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You can follow the podcast on social media at Leaving Eden Podcast. You can follow me on social media at GAVRIELHACOHEN. Sadie?
I got Threads.
You got Threads? I'm not on Threads anymore. I stopped.
I need to sign in on the podcast account. You can follow me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music, and on Threads, and on TikTok at Sadie Carpenter 1.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You guys have a great day. Bye-bye.
But old rolling river of time healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion, there'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided